Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is our weekend edition, and we certainly welcome you to the program today. A little bit later, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We can go through all the P's, the pandemic, the protests, the presidential campaign, and a variety of other things. And, of course, some of those don't rhyme with P or start with the letter P, but we'll get into some of that. And certainly we have, as we said even last Friday, a lot to cover. But we'll do our best to try to cover what we can.
You didn't make one of those lists with 45 items on it?
I thought about doing that, but I figured we might talk about the fact we have a new country in Seattle. That's something I just mentioned yesterday, but we didn't get into it. But nevertheless, we have Penna Dexter here. Of course, she's been here so many times, but it's been a while since we've seen Lathan Watts.
So good to see you, Lathan.
Director of Community Relations now, right?
Public Affairs.
Public Affairs. Oh, we got to fix it again on the screen there. We just never can quite get it right. Public Affairs. Right. We'll get that right. But there's a reason we haven't seen you in a while. It's not because we don't like you. We really love you, and you know how many times I like to quote you, which we're going to do in just a minute when we talk about the lead article here. But you had just a bit of a health scare, I guess we could call it.
A little bit, yes. Thank you so much. It's great to be back, and thanks to all of the listeners who heard about what was going on and said a prayer for me. I can let you know that it worked. I suffered what they call a subarachnoid hemorrhage, basically an aneurysm, a ruptured blood vessel near my brainstem, and spent about 4 days in the ICU here at Med City Plano, and was then able to go home and rest for a couple of weeks, and then was able to get back to work and happy to do it. But it was pretty scary there for some moments. Yeah. But once kind of like getting a bruise anywhere else in your body, once the body absorbed that blood, then I was free to go home. It was almost comical to me listening to the doctors try to explain what happened, but I knew, and they never really could explain how or why the bleeding started, but I knew for a fact with all my heart why the bleeding stopped.
Yes.
So thanks to everybody that put in a word for me, the man upstairs. It worked.
Yes. And Penna, if nothing else, this is a lesson for especially the men who say, I'll just do better. But you went from normal to really in pain. And at least that time you didn't say to your wife, I'll get better. It'll get better. You said, we got to do something about this.
It was. And I am one that tends to minimize things and, haven't really gone, to the doctor for much of anything. I'm usually just like you said, kind of the typical, I'll be okay.
But that was too much to say.
It was clear to me. I mean, it was like nothing I had ever felt before. So I knew something was going on, and went to the doctor and explained what was going on. They sent me directly to the emergency room there in Louisville, where I live, and doctor did a CAT scan immediately and found some blood there, and so sent me over to that city facility in Plano, better equipped to deal with it, and they did a great job. So thanks to all the people there, treated me well, and it was. It's hard for me to put it into words, honestly, without getting emotional about it.
Yeah.
But prayer works. I would just leave it at that.
That's so good.
So just one question, because
Sure.
I heard about it the day it happened, and I immediately thought of COVID, and he has to go into the healthcare system. Was that? I mean, I'm sure it was hard because you couldn't get visitors, but
Right.
Other than that, was it? Did COVID affect your care or anything like that?
Well, when I went to the ER, they screened me, like, no temperature, no symptoms of anything else. They drew a lot of blood for a lot of different reasons, and I assume they tested some of that for COVID. When I finally got into the ICU in Plano, I asked the first nurse that was on duty more for, I knew other people were going to ask me about it, like my wife and kids, because they weren't allowed in. And so I asked her, are there COVID patients on this wing? Are you dealing with COVID patients? She said, no, that hospital is big enough. They have multiple ICUs, and we have the COVID patients are in their own. They're not, and those of us that, the staff that work with them aren't then rotating and working in other places. So I knew that, I wasn't required to wear, a mask unless I was like in my room. When they took me down to do an MRI or an angiogram when I was going to be out in the hallway, everybody wore masks, but I wasn't really worried about, COVID. That was the least of my worries at that point.
I would think so.
It was challenging, I think, more for my family just because they couldn't be there physically and wanted to. And for me to not have anybody to laugh at my jokes, while I was in the ER, waiting to go up to my room in the ICU, over the PA or loudspeaker or whatever, they announced that there was a security alert on wing XYZ, people have been dispatched, blah, 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 blah. And I turned to the ER nurse who was working with me. I said, that's probably my wife trying to break in here because you've told them that you told her she can't come in. And she looked at me and she's like, yeah, that's funny. That's funny. I'm like, really? That's all I get out of it? That's funny.
That's all you get.
Yeah, there was a gunshot victim brought into the ER while I was waiting.
Wow.
And again, it's just sort of my personality. I can't help it. I have kind of a gallows sense of humor, and this guy, rightfully so, is pretty loud. I probably would be too if I was shot. And I turned to the nurse. I was like, "Can you tell the gunshot victim to keep it down? I've got a headache." and she looked at me first like she wasn't sure if I was serious or not. And I kind of grinned. She's like, "Yeah, that's funny. That's funny." Come on. Really? That's all I get?
That's all you get. Well, and we haven't been able to see some of those vintage Lathan Watts videos. So are those going to be
they will be returning, right? Yeah, I had to take a break from those. The Legalese with Lathan will be coming back soon, hopefully. And maybe even something a little bit bigger. I can't really break the news yet,
okay.
But I would suspect the next time you see a Legalese with Lathan, it'll be introducing something else. So just stay tuned, I guess.
Sounds pretty good. Yeah. Again, Director of Public Affairs, right, for First Liberty Institute. We got it right the second time. Penna, when we come back from the break, though, I thought we might talk about a couple of pieces. One of those is the first article that responds to CNN's op-ed on religious freedom. We have said that we've gone from a time in which people that were talking about religious freedom were oftentimes put in the same category as civil libertarians and people that were just in the very center of our country. And then now you have people saying, these people that want religious liberty, well, they just want to prevent individuals from actually having an opportunity to have a normal life. So we're going to get into that. I think you did a very good response there. And, of course, we had one coming out today. So when we come back, let's see if we can talk about a couple of those issues. And if you'd like to follow along, that's the first of many articles we've posted on the website today. No doubt we're going to get into a number of others, tearing down statutes, creating a new country, sort of, the country of Chaz in Seattle. I can't make this stuff up. As well as all sorts of people that after they say something that looks like common sense, they have to apologize for it. So we'll talk about that cancel culture and much more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
George Barna has been doing an extensive inventory of worldviews in America through the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He was on my radio program last week to talk about two of his most recent surveys dealing with truth and morality. Now, past generations of Americans viewed God as the basis of truth. Not only has that changed for the general population, it has also changed significantly within the church. He found that there are certain groups that rejected the idea of absolute truth. That would be members of the LGBTQ community, political liberals, spiritual skeptics, Democrats, and young people under the age of 50. By contrast, those most likely to see God as the basis of truth are the group called SageCons. That stands for Spiritually Active, Governance-Engaged Conservative Christians. Nearly 9 out of 10 point to God as the source of truth. More than 6 in 10 recognize the existence of absolute moral standards. In his next report, he decided to see how we apply moral principles in real-life situations. The questions ranged from telling a white lie to failing to pay back a loan to speeding to abortion. It was troubling to see what percentage of Americans felt that some of these behaviors were not even a moral issue. In some cases, a significant percentage might have believed it was a moral issue, but it was morally acceptable in today's society. Another troubling finding was what Barna calls a seismic shift in Christian views about morality. For example, born-again Christians in the survey were 3 times as likely to say they rely on the Bible for primary moral guidance, but less than half actually do so. The latest Barna surveys are a reminder to pastors and other Christian teachers that we need to make the case for moral absolutes based on God's Word. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Penna Dexter here, as well as Lathan Watts, and we have all sorts of information about both of them. We have Penna Dexter's commentary today. We'll get to that a little bit later. Scrapping the SAT, of course, Lathan Watts is, of course, the Director of Public Affairs, First Liberty. We have a link to First Liberty, and we certainly do encourage you to support them as we come to the end of their fiscal year. And in about an hour, we'll be talking with Gary Bauer, and we'll encourage you to support all that he does as well. So, Penna, if nothing else, this first article is a great response by Lathan Watts on an op-ed that appeared in CNN.
Well, First Liberty Institute has, I feel, taken much of the lead in the country in defending the rights of churches during this COVID-19 episode that we've had in the country. And so, of course, churches are beginning to reopen. And Lathan found, I did not see this, but Lathan points this out up on the CNN website, a statement that they made that's just disgusting. They say religious freedom is not a license to spread the coronavirus, and this is not the first time it has been exploited to pursue a conservative agenda. For years, conservatives have tried to use religious freedom as a license to deny women reproductive health care or discriminate against LGBTQ people. And this is a way that we've seen the left demonize religion. And then they start blasting the groups like yours that are trying to defend these rights and defend really biblical truth in many cases. You had a great response to this, Lathan.
Thank you. It was. It came out, I guess it's been a couple of weeks now, and that article came out in our newsletter. And they actually, I think, if you went to CNN's website now to find that op-ed, I think they actually changed the title because originally it said distorting religious freedom is like dangerous for the country, or whatever. And you could summarize my response with, yes, the way you have distorted religious freedom is dangerous for the country. And I think they actually changed the title on the article. I'm not taking credit for it, but when I read the article on the op-ed on CNN's website, that was my first comment, was the title is the only thing that's accurate. And that's what prompted the response. Like, yeah, okay, so let's write a response.
Well, they say that that there's a license to go back. There's a license to do all these bad things that they think are being done, and that in itself, you point out, is in error. It's a fallacy.
Exactly. They say it shouldn't be used as a license to fill in the blank, spread COVID, discriminate against LGBTQ, whatever. And so I pointed out that a license is something that is granted by government and then can therefore be repealed by government. And religious liberty is not a license to do anything. It is a fundamental human right. It is a natural right, and it cannot be given or taken by government. The reason for the existence of government is to protect rights such as religious liberty. Mm-hmm. So it from the very beginning, it sort of demonstrated the lack of understanding of the CNN writer. And I started with there's nothing wrong with the position the writer takes that can't be neatly summed up with the word everything. But when you have such a clear distillation of their argument, like to just dismiss it is kind of a missed opportunity. So let's take it, point by point and address it. Mm-hmm. And that was the first. What you did. That was the first point, which is you're correct. It's not a license to do anything. It is a fundamental human right protected by government that cannot be repealed even in times of crisis. The government's response has to be in keeping with balancing the protection of rights and whatever else the government seeks to do.
This really shows in sharp, I think, focus the cluelessness of the media about the Constitution. I mean, it's just, it's appalling. It really is.
Well, he goes on to say that, trying to make the point that, as we've heard a lot, religious liberty is just a cover for trying to protect people's biases or discrimination or whatever. And the cases he points to try to make this conclusion were the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and the
Hobby Lobby court case.
Yes, the Hobby Lobby case. Yeah. So I went to explain that okay, so the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, the only discrimination that the Supreme Court found was by the state of Colorado against Jack Phillips.
Right.
Hobby Lobby didn't seek to deny anything to anybody. They just said they weren't going to pay for it, and that the access to contraception was the same before and after that decision, and had the decision gone in the opposite direction, you could not say the same for religious liberty. What was at issue in both of those was the business owner's right to run their business in keeping with their faith. And so, I was almost, befuddled at why would you point to these two cases?
Because it's LGBTQ kind of things, yeah.
Yeah, so... basically. But, if you're going to point to cases, maybe point to cases where you've won instead of lost. So, and then the author goes on to jump to a poll, which I'm not really sure, and my response is that, he points to the poll saying that this position that he tries to hang on First Liberty and other religious liberty defense firms is it's out of step with even religious people, and he cites a poll. Well, that may make him feel better, and contribute to his, what I assume is already a robust sense of moral superiority. But polls are completely irrelevant when it comes to the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution was written to protect rights against the whims of a majority. So even if this poll reflected the opinion of a majority of Americans, so I mean, the right exists and is protected specifically so that if a particular belief becomes unpopular in the culture, it is still protected, because the belief you don't like right now, that you may, have some sort of consternation over the fact that it's being protected by law. Well, at some point it might be your beliefs that are unpopular. And I promise you will be running to the First Amendment for protection. That's why we defend people of all faiths. That's why our client list is what
very
it is.
diverse.
Orthodox Jews and Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and every denomination of Christianity you can think of, and probably a couple you can't, because you never know whose beliefs are going to be out of fashion this week, and that's what the Constitution is there to protect.
So then he makes the statement, which was the title, "Distorting religious freedom will put people in danger." That's supposed to be the dagger.
Right.
But it actually, you turned it on its head.
Right. Like I said, the title, the original title, is the only thing accurate. When you distort religious freedom like he has in this article and sort of inflame people's opinion against people of faith, you get what happens to clients like ours, like Aaron and Melissa Klein. The tons of hate mail that they got, threats against them. It is dangerous if you distort religious liberty to turn it into something that it's not, and uninformed people believe it. Then it can be dangerous. We have, there was a church burned down in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And what was left of the building, they found the graffiti that says, I guess you won't be meeting now, you hypocrites. They just wanted to meet in keeping with the health and safety precautions that were in place. They just wanted to gather to worship.
I think one of the dangers, too, we've talked about this before, is the longer you kept churches from meeting and considered them as things open up in the culture, but churches are not allowed to because somehow somebody says they're not essential, as maybe a drugstore would be or a supermarket. That's in itself dangerous and harmful. Certainly.
I mean, you have to treat, if you're going to allow marijuana dispensaries and liquor stores and abortion clinics, or take something even less controversial. If I can stand 6 feet away from somebody at Home Depot and we're both okay, I can sit 6 feet away from somebody in a church building. And once you start treating churches as less than other, now you're in trouble, and that's when you're probably going to hear from us. And lots of people did. And thankfully, we were able to get that stuff resolved.
Yeah. Well, again, that's the first article we've posted here. We'll come back. We'll mention just another one real quickly and then get into some other topics as well, because we want in this country supposedly to tear down statues and do all sorts of other things to prevent individuals from speaking out. And that's why we're glad we have a First Amendment, and that's why we're glad that First Liberty is part of this as well. But if you'd like to read this, it is available on the website, pointofview.net. And as I mentioned before, we have Lathan Watts with us, Penna Dexter, and in about an hour, we'll also have Gary Bauer for a while. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do more right after these important messages.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts in studio, and if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Penna, we were talking about this one on religious liberty, and the individual that wrote this, and I've read a little bit more about some of the other comments he's made, really was more upset about LGBTQ issues, but also brought up the issue of COVID-19. And this is now the other drumbeat. I mean, if you want to eliminate Donald Trump and make sure that he's defeated, for a long time the left hook has been to him over the pandemic. Now the right cross is over the issue of racism. But let's come back to COVID-19 for just a minute, because now there are people criticizing the president because he's downplaying, they say, the deaths. And 116,000 individuals that have died is no small amount. But again, we have, 325 million Americans. When you look at how many of those individuals died in nursing homes, which shouldn't have, we don't want to downplay the death of any individual, but COVID-19 is still an issue that's been out there. And for a couple of weeks, we haven't really been talking about it because we've been talking about protests and riots.
It's like one thing after another coming so quickly. And, we thought at the beginning of this, think back to early March, the numbers were like 2 million people were going to die, and 100,000 in the U.S. have died. So, I mean, it's not good news, as you said, that we have a pandemic, but we do have one. And there's reports now that in some states that have opened up, there is actually, they call it a second wave. But the Wall Street Journal, I read today, and I think they're absolutely right when they say the bigger threat is keeping the economy in a coma. So we needed to open up. I think honest people said there would be more cases. We also have more testing everywhere, so you're going to have that. There are more hospitalizations in some places like Texas. We have more hospitalizations.
Very true.
As states reopen, although Governor Abbott has said that our capacity is got margin to it. So we'll be able to handle these. And so, it's up 1/3. The cases are up 1/3 in Texas. Let's be honest about it. And we've seen even reaction in the stock market this week to that. But one of the things that was pointed out is that large prisons and meatpacking plants are areas where the increases are in Texas. And Houston and Austin areas are 20% up since the state began to reopen. Much of it is also in nursing homes still here in the state of Texas. And then the other number is that the death rates in Texas are dropping. So we're handling the pandemic. We're taking care of people. The immunity testing is going on, too. And I had one this week. I was negative. My husband and I had them. And my doctor said when he reported that to us that the numbers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area are about 4% positives are coming through. So that's very, very low. So this whole idea of asymptomatic spread of it, they haven't debunked it, but it's less important than we thought, which makes me look back at shutting down the economy with, kind of regretful thoughts.
By the way, let me just mention that real quickly. I'll probably do this next week because every once in a while I kind of geek out on science because I have a science background.
Yes.
And one of the things I've been noticing is the number of times these very prestigious journals have had to back off. And one of those gets to that argument, and that is the World Health Organization argued months ago based upon a very good article that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the most prestigious journals out there, that you could transmit COVID-19 if you were asymptomatic. They have retracted that, and that doesn't happen very often because they finally concluded that maybe you could transmit it if you were pre-symptomatic, but not asymptomatic. Now, that goes with another very prestigious journal, which is The Lancet, which is a British medical journal, a very prestigious, which pulled theirs off because they were talking about that particular drug treatment of hydroxychloroquine, saying that this was leading to more deaths, and they said there were some really major flaws in that. Next week, I'll talk about two other journals, another New England Journal article that's been pulled, and one from, if I remember right, I think it was the proceedings of one of the particular medical institutes. And so we've had four major, very significant articles withdrawn, which is kind of like being a lawyer and losing every one of your cases. I mean, it is embarrassing when you have these supposedly refereed journal articles now being withdrawn. And I think it illustrates again that in all of this rush to get information out, people have made some really big mistakes. And I can't help, especially with the Lancet one. Lancet, a few weeks before, it actually said, they were calling, this is a Brit medical journal, calling for people to vote against Donald Trump. And then about 2 weeks later announced that, well, actually one of the articles we have, which was kind of the drug of favorite of Donald Trump, was, having to be withdrawn. So there's a lot of political bias, even in the scientific community, don't you think?
I think there is. And we have the political bias behind everything that's happened with COVID-19 has been, it's been sad to see science co-opted in a sense by politics. Not that it never happens. It happens all the time. But in this case, it had so many dramatic effects on our economy, which is very upsetting.
Lathan, I mentioned lawyers, so I wanted to get your comments.
Yeah, I'll say it's more like being a judge and having your ruling overturned on appeal.
Well, that'd be a good one. There's a perfect illustration. I'm going to use that one when I write about, because I think I'm going to do a commentary, because this has been really amazing. My father was in the pharmaceutical industry. My grandfather was a doctor, so I've always had very high respect for people, especially when they publish in some of the most prestigious journals out there. My father always had the New England Journal of Medicine on our coffee table, and then to see that in two separate cases they had to pull back very significant articles, you have to say, what is going on? This has never really happened too often, and this is a real source of some concern.
It is, and the so-called experts telling you one thing one week and the exact opposite the next week, as this whole thing has transpired, I think has long-term consequences also, and it has social and cultural impacts. Hindsight's always 20/20, but when you're dealing with something you've never dealt with before, there really isn't an expert. If it's brand new, as this thing supposedly is, and we don't have really any sort of experience with it, then maybe we should have been a little bit more skeptical of the people holding themselves out to be experts in it. I mean, how many different messages did we get about wearing masks?
Oh yeah,
it started out. No, you don't need one. I'm still trying to
figure out which one's true.
Yeah, and we still don't have a definitive answer on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and it was every week it was something new. And so I think that's what, after a while, I said in sort of casual conversation while I was laid up at home, not on the radio here, that the American people will reopen America.
Yeah.
When they have had enough, they will reopen
And
America, regardless of what government says. And there will be people in government who will see the parade coming down the street and try to jump out in front of it and act like they're leading it, or they will get run over by it. Mm-hmm. And that's what started happening. You had people just say, well, okay, do what you got to do, but I'm opening my business. My employees are starving or can't feed their families or are going to get kicked out of their apartments or whatever, and I'm not going to wait around for another check from the federal government of money they don't have to begin with.
Right.
And that's what started happening.
And then churches, I thought it was interesting how the Supreme Court actually went the wrong way on churches reopening, this church in California. But there was all these churches in California that had already planned on reopening no matter what, and they did. And the governor actually backed down somewhat. So some of the state authorities have backed down because people were going to do it anyway. And some of those states that were being
and some of those states we had to send a letter to those states or those counties or those cities, whatever the case may be. Some of them we had to say, okay, if you do this, we'll see you in court. And I think, as you said, I think they thought better of it, and we were successful. So far, we've been successful in every matter we've engaged in related to churches and COVID, and had the very first case in the country in Kentucky. So In one of our cases in Kentucky, the judge, they wrote a very good opinion about it, is now
I just
a
saw
nominee for the Circuit Court of Appeals in D.C.
And really came out in favor of religious liberty. So that was really good. We come back from the break, though. I thought maybe for just a minute, since we're on this idea of COVID, we have a vaccine. And that's a whole question that people have. And I think we should have been asking questions about those models. But my suggestion is we should be asking some questions about some vaccines, because right now we're pursuing a viral vaccine, we're pursuing an RNA vaccine, and even an antigen vaccine. And the argument is we'll have 100 million, maybe, vaccines by the first part of next year. But will that really happen? And if we do, how can we test it? And then, would those be mandatory? So we've got a couple other questions put on the table. We'll talk about those right after this.
Some colleges and universities have decided to stop using the SAT and ACT exams to make admissions decisions. The largest system to make such an announcement is the University of California. Its size and prestige will certainly influence others. The Wall Street Journal's Jason Riley says that's unfortunate because low-income minorities have more to lose than gain from the end of standardized testing. One critique is that test questions contain cultural bias that would make it harder for racial and ethnic minorities or low-income applicants to do well. For example, of 4 possible comparisons, runner is to marathon best parallels the relationship of oarsman to regatta. SAT critics contend that such a question discriminates, since an inner-city student would be less likely than a white kid from an upscale community to know that a regatta is a boat race. Another complaint is that low-income students are less likely to take prep courses. The Journal's Jason Riley, who is black, points out, questions that depend on exposure to white privilege are rare, not typical. Factors like study habits, time spent reading books versus watching television, the size and complexity of vocabulary a student is exposed to growing up, and the quality of elementary school that student attended are behind the racial and ethnic disparities in scores. A family's wealth provides advantages, but as University of Virginia sociologist W. Bradford Wilcox points out, when it comes to who will succeed in college, the most privileged students are those from intact families. The SAT is actually a good way to identify kids from difficult backgrounds who have academic potential. Blacks and Hispanics do score lower on average than whites and Asians on these tests. It may be taboo to mention it, but fatherlessness is the primary reason for the achievement gap. The SAT and ACT tests are not the problem. Getting rid of them will only paper over and obscure this reality, and do nothing to change it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener's source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts here. Next hour, we get into, of course, all of the things happening in our culture. But since we were on COVID-19 and we mentioned vaccines, I thought I'd bring it up for just a second because it is something I've mentioned once this week, but people tune in and tune out. And first of all, when you look at the production of a vaccine, usually takes about a decade, sometimes as much as 2 decades. And so there is an attempt to rush this through very quickly. By the way, again, if you look at the numbers, new vaccine trials usually end up with about a 90% failure rate. Now, we are in the process right now of speeding up those trials in a couple of ways. They usually do animal trials and then human trials. They're doing those simultaneously. If they think that one of these vaccines looks pretty good, they will produce the vials of those vaccines, and then as the trials complete, if it's a failure, then they'll destroy it. So in some respects, we're doing something that doesn't necessarily give a lot of people confidence. There's three kinds of vaccines being developed right now. The viral vaccine, where you give it what's called an attenuated one, and that's with AstraZeneca right now. There's one that is using RNA to actually mimic some of the spokes, if you will, on the coronavirus, and that one is being done by Moderna in Boston. And there's one which is an antigen vaccine, which is being done in France by Sanofi. So I've been researching that, and I went into that in some detail. But it does raise some very good questions. Number one, are we really going to have 100 million of these vaccines by next year? Number two, how are we going to test it? Because normally you have a few of these have gone through the first test where we give it to healthy people and we see whether it stimulates an immune response and see if there's any side effects. But now we're moving into phase 2, but you have to have people that have COVID-19. And there are a lot of people that are getting over it, and so they don't have COVID-19. So one of the things John Stossel talked about the other day is we might have to go to what's called a human challenge trial, which is a fancy name of saying, I will inject the virus, the coronavirus, into your body so that you then have the virus, so then I can try the vaccine on. But, of course, what you have in these trials is some people get the vaccine, which may or may not work, and some people get the placebo when they have the virus in the first place.
And they're given the virus, but they're never given the vaccine.
Think about that for just a minute.
Wow.
Yeah, who wants to sign up?
Yeah, I don't see either. I can look at the eye, look at both of your eyes, saying, "I'm not signing up
You
for
first.
that." Yeah, you first.
So are people signing up for that?
The numbers I've seen are that there are 24,000 people that are in about 100 different countries, because there is actually a group who are trying to find healthy young people who volunteered to be infected. And if you're younger, not the old guy like me around the table, that's the case. But okay, so then you go through all of those trials, and then finally there's the third trial, which would be thousands of people to look for any possible side effects. And of course, we're pushing this faster than we've ever pushed it before. And then once you maybe get a vaccine that works, well, it only works if a fairly significant number of Americans actually want to take the vaccine. And the latest survey that I've looked at say that half of Americans would not want to get the vaccine.
Most people would wait and watch other people and see what happens.
And it kind of ranges, because the older you are, the more likely you want to get a vaccine, 67%. But the younger you are, the less likely. Here's an interesting one. The lowest percentage, African Americans. Only 25% of African Americans said I would get the vaccine, which means sometimes right now they're the ones hardest hit. And if indeed you do get the vaccine, then we are having people talk about you would get an immunity passport. And so that would, and again, would a lot of people say...
So they do what I did and have their blood tested to see if the immunity showed up, whether they'd had a vaccine or had COVID itself.
Yeah, or again, would we have to have mandatory vaccines? And so they're just all sorts of big questions that we should be talking about right now, don't you think? I'll go around the round table and see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I don't know if you call it mandatory vaccines. It seems like we have that for a lot of other things, because then it's hard to go to school unless you get some kind of an exemption for your child. So, but it's a real freedom grab, especially when something is so untested and unproven.
Rushing to do something this big and this important is, I don't think, a good idea ever.
Nope.
So it's interesting that the poll that you mentioned as to who said they would get it and who wouldn't, because elderly populations are more vulnerable to this anyway. So
they're
it's
smarter
good.
though sometimes.
but they're the ones who responded that yes, I would get the vaccine more than anybody else. Well, that's good. I mean, if the vaccine works, that's the population that's the most vulnerable. That's who you would want to have it. So yeah, it's never a good idea to rush something this big, this important. We seem to be dealing with, even as the numbers that Penna pointed out in the previous segment, America seems to be dealing with it.
Yeah.
And the increase, as you mentioned before, is still a lot of it is related to, like you said, nursing homes, prisons,
And
meatpacking plants,
and testing.
And well, yeah, but in places where the numbers are up, that a lot of it is attributed to that. In places where you can't, distance, and so, and that's been consistent through the entire thing. When you look at where spikes have happened, it was sending people with coronavirus back to nursing homes.
Yeah,
I don't see how anybody thought that was a good idea to begin with, but certainly in hindsight, we know it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And the general population seems to be dealing with it, and so rushing to vaccinate everybody for something. I don't think rushing into something that big and that important is ever a good idea. So let's take the time to do it right, and maybe this eventually becomes something that we don't have to worry about that much.
I've heard some people say the vaccine could kill more people than COVID does. And certainly we have seen cases where vaccines were rushed and where people took them. The swine flu, in my lifetime, I can remember.
1976.
That caused a lot of illness and sickness and death, and that was the vaccine itself. So I think we ought to look carefully at and if they try to make it mandatory, Americans ought to rise up, because people should at least be able to make, at the very minimum, be able to make their own decisions about that.
There are even petitions out there done by another group, not to be confused with yours. It has the word liberty in it. Mm-hmm. Liberty Counsel has been talking about this issue because people might have religious objections and things of that nature. But back to the point Penna made, I did mention that in my commentary. It comes out next week, and that's in 1976. At that time, President Gerald Ford, that's where the old guys around the table remember this, and some of our younger listeners, matter of fact, next week when we do our Millennial Roundtable, they don't even remember any of this. But it was the swine flu vaccine program that really was rushed through, and a number of Americans, quite a number, by the way, developed a rare disorder in which the body's immune system attacks the nerves, and that
Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Yes, well, okay, you got the name. And as a matter of fact, we had even a Dallas Cowboy that had that. So, this is something that we sometimes run into, but all of a sudden you started seeing the spikes that come from there. And of course, there's some, because of any vaccine, you might have the possibility of some kind of side effects or contraindications and things of that nature. You're putting, in some cases, either a crippled virus in there, or you're trying to stimulate an antibody reaction or an antigen reaction. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. And when you're rushing it, never a good idea. Anyway, just thought I'd put that on the table. We did talk about it earlier in the week, and since we kind of got into it, we come back. I want to get my history major here to talk about history. Why are we tearing down all these statues? And what about this so-called cancel culture? And of course, we have a new country up there in Seattle, so we just got a lot to talk about, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. It is our Friday weekend edition, and we are so grateful that you could join us today. In studio with me, Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts, who is the Director of Public Affairs for First Liberty Institute. And we have posted a number of articles, one that I did discuss previously with Lathan on CNN's op-ed on religious freedom, but we have some that we want to look at now during this hour, and one of those is called The Cancel Counter. It is a very lengthy one. If you want to print it out, make sure you got a lot of print paper in your printer. It has about 24 various articles and examples of statues that have been torn down, individuals that have made oftentimes very common sense kinds of statements. We talked about J.K. Rowling yesterday, making some really obvious, I think, biologically sound statements about transgenderism, and then how these individuals are being criticized. And so let's, if nothing else, because Penna Dexter is here, and of course Lathan, not only a lawyer, but I remember you are a history major, so I want to get into this. City of Boston finally decided we might as well take down the Christopher Columbus statue because it was beheaded by vandals. Now, I might point out that was attacked back in 2006, and the head was cut off back then. It was doused with red paint that said Black Lives Matter, but they put it back up. But this time the mayor said, I might as well take it down. And so whether it's Christopher Columbus statues in places like Boston, Massachusetts, Richmond, Virginia, whether it's now people calling for us to take down the Washington Monument, or at least rename it, to take down the Jefferson Memorial or rename it. And of course, in just a minute, I want to get to a couple of these other examples. Penna, what you have right now is where instead of having a discussion about, does it make sense to have a Robert E. Lee statue, now what's happening is the vandals are defacing them and winning by default, because the mayor's city council saying, okay, since it's been defaced, we'll just tear it down. And we're not even having a discussion about whether there's a value in having that statue up or not.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sad over the years because of these historical figures that of the Confederacy that are being erased. So it's erasing a part of our history. You're the historian, Lathan, but now it's being, like so many other things in the culture, the policy is coming because of the anarchy that's out there, and the violence and the destruction is forcing the issue on a lot of things, and that's what's happening on some of these statues, and it's very sad.
History is complex because people are complex.
Sure.
History is the story of people. Every individual person who's ever walked the face of this earth is a complex story. There's only one who walked it who was perfect, and we killed him for it. Mm-hmm. Okay? So there are things in the life of every person who's ever lived that we would not be proud of. And there are, hopefully, things in the life of every person who's ever lived that are things to be lauded. Okay? History is complex because it's the story of people. Mm-hmm. And the people who are memorialized in statues all over the country, regardless of who they are, they have had an impact on history. That's why the statues exist. You can look at the context of when the statue was placed. You can look at the context of that person's life. There are all sorts of factors to analyze. and they are typically intended as all memorials are, as conversation starters, as to draw your attention to something. If they're removed, what starts the conversation? Two people, all symbols are subject to interpretation. So two people can have very different reactions to the same historical figure. What do we use in public then to start conversations like that? If you don't have, conversation starters, conversation piece.
You majored in history, and I always thought of history as wanting to get as much information as you could about things that happen, so that you can look at it and filter it. Then you can filter it through your politics after you do that. So more information is better, not less information. But when you start tearing down monuments, when you start saying, okay, HBO, you can't show Gone with the Wind anymore. I mean, when you start removing parts of history so that one narrative then can dictate what we all believe as Americans, that's not freedom anymore. And so, we fought these battles over Confederate flags and over Confederate figures being in statues, and we win some and we lose some. But it's been the discussion, I think, that's been important. But now we're not even allowed to have the discussion. The policy just takes it where it has to go, and the country becomes much poorer for it.
Let's, if we can, too, also point out, I love this article here by Madeline Kearns, The Thoughtless Campaign Against Western History, and it shows the people trying to vandalize I just love this. Winston Churchill. Mm-hmm. And then at the base it says fascist. And I like what somebody did on a Twitter post saying, if you think he's a fascist, wait till you see the other guy. Yeah. Or the one that a lot of us have talked about this week. It's one of the articles that we've posted here. It's number 21, the statue of Matthias Baldwin. And he was doused in paint. The word colonizers written under his name in the pedestal. He was an abolitionist. He was an activist who built a successful manufacturing business in Philadelphia. He actually worked out of his way to help the abolitionists to actually fight the slave trade. And yet you can go and look his name up right now if you want to do a YouTube video or go to even a Google search and see colonizer, murderer. And here's a man that actually fought for the voting rights for African Americans, built schools for black children out of his own largesse, and he's vilified along with everybody else. So whether it's Winston Churchill or Matthias Baldwin, or the list is now getting pretty long of those that should never have been defaced, it just illustrates again the historical illiteracy of some of the people out on the street.
Yes, absolutely. Please, for the love of all things holy, read a book. Okay? If you won't read a book, watch a good movie, one that's well done. Okay, some of the people defaced the monument in Boston to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first all-black regiments.
Yep.
In the Union Army. It's a great movie. Morgan Freeman, Matthew Broderick, go watch it. It's called Glory.
Great movie.
So yes, it is. This is what happens when you have in certain instances mob rule. And we're, the triumph of the ignorant. And it's also, I think, probably a symptom of our education system and the oversimplification of history. Like I said before, history's complex because people are complex. When you reduce things down to blue, good, gray, bad, you get stuff like this. And then if you don't even know who was wearing blue and who was wearing gray, you deface a monument to the 54th Massachusetts. So, yes, it is obviously something that gets me a little fired up.
Yes.
Because I love history, and I want people to know their history. Mm-hmm. If you don't know it, you are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
That's why we should study it.
We've done programs on not only racism, but slave trade and on Indian wars and everything like that. And so those are dark chapters in history, but to simply laud those or to talk about those and nothing else is, of course, no more historically accurate than what's going out on the streets right now. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
George Barna has been doing an extensive inventory of worldviews in America through the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He was on my radio program last week to talk about two of his most recent surveys dealing with truth and morality. Now, past generations of Americans viewed God as the basis of truth. Not only has that changed for the general population, it has also changed significantly within the church. He found that there are certain groups that rejected the idea of absolute truth. That would be members of the LGBTQ community, political liberals, spiritual skeptics, Democrats, and young people under the age of 50. By contrast, those most likely to see God as the basis of truth are the group called SageCons. That stands for Spiritually Active, Governance-Engaged Conservative Christians. Nearly 9 out of 10 point to God as the source of truth. More than 6 in 10 recognize the existence of absolute moral standards. In his next report, he decided to see how we apply moral principles in real-life situations. The questions ranged from telling a white lie to failing to pay back a loan to speeding to abortion. It was troubling to see what percentage of Americans felt that some of these behaviors were not even a moral issue. In some cases, a significant percentage might have believed it was a moral issue, but it was morally acceptable in today's society. Another troubling finding was what Barna calls a seismic shift in Christian views about morality. For example, born-again Christians in the survey were 3 times as likely to say they rely on the Bible for primary moral guidance, but less than half actually do so. The latest Barna surveys are a reminder to pastors and other Christian teachers that we need to make the case for moral absolutes based on God's Word. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have in studio with us today Lathan Watts, Penna Dexter, and in about 15 minutes we'll have Gary Bauer with us as well. He's posted quite a number of things today, and we'll get into some of that in just a minute. Individuals that have made statements or given some perspective which were not radical enough for the radicals in the street or out there on social media, so we'll talk about that. And we have yet to talk about what's going on in Seattle, which is the new country supposedly of Chad, or Chaz, I should say. It's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. We'll get into that in just a minute, but let's take some phone calls along the way. 1-800-351-1212 in Georgia on the Good News Network. Jonathan, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kerby. Hey, Lathan. Hey, Penna.
Yes, sir.
Wanted to ask a question directed at you, Mr. Lathan.
Sure.
I have a friend of mine that I respect a lot, and he seems to be of the opinion here near a big city of mine in Macon of tearing down a Confederate statue because of what it stands for. And one of his arguments was that the Civil War was all about slavery and not so much about states' rights. And I wanted to get your view on that, being that is your area of expertise. Was the Civil War... was it more about states' rights or slavery, or was it more of like an inclusive yes? or get your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, thanks for that question, I think. So I mean, I should start out with a lot of probably disclaimers. First, there are plenty of people in the country and probably in this building who know more about history than I do. I love history, and I read a lot about it, and that is my undergrad degree, but there are lots of people who know more than I do. Second, anything that does not relate to the work of First Liberty Institute, my opinion is mine and mine alone. That said, I think the answer to your question is yes. Yes, it was about secession. Yes, it was about slavery. It was about lots of things. Like I said before, history's complex. It would be ludicrous to say that the Civil War was not about slavery. You had, from the very beginning, from the beginning of the colonies, you had people who were different in ethnicity, in religion, in geography, in lots of ways. You had 13 colonies that were, life in those colonies was very, very different. Life in New York at the time the country was founded was very different than life in Georgia and South Carolina. It still is, right? But yes, the Civil War is a extremely complex period in history, and that's why I mentioned earlier that it does no justice to anyone to oversimplify it, to just say, blue good, gray bad, North freedom, South slavery. Are elements of that true? Of course, yes. Lots of people volunteered to fight for the Union Army to end slavery in this country, and thank God for them. Lots of people in the South were fighting to preserve slavery as it existed in the South. That is not the only factor. So it's not to minimize slavery to say that there are other factors involved. It's a very complex period of history. And so rightfully so, people are conflicted over how to remember it and how, if it should be memorialized, how it should be memorialized. As somebody who believes in sort of federalism, that these are 50 states and that life in Texas is very different than life in New Hampshire or California or any other state. I'm totally fine with leaving that issue to states to decide for themselves how they want to deal with that. And Texas may decide to do something very different than what your state in Georgia does. But I think it's a symptom, like I said before, of trying to oversimplify issues. And there's no really simple answer to it. And there may not be an answer that makes everybody happy. Mm-hmm. It would be great if we could with all sorts of issues, but sometimes that's just not possible. You got to, and you do the best you can.
When you talk about the states, they get to choose. For instance, Nancy Pelosi has said, let's get rid of. She's chosen 11 statues in the Capitol that she thinks should be done away with. But states do get to make their own offering of the statue that's there. And so that's another case in which, they have the right, and really anything like that, it's a portrayal of our history. And it's just a place where you may be just such a Southerner that you're still almost a Confederate. I mean, I know people like that. And so to have these discussions in our country shouldn't be forbidden, and we shouldn't have authorities who get, or bullies who get to say, what we get to talk about and what we don't. And, I talked earlier about just a TV station pulling Gone with the Wind. There's lots of now self-censorship going on. And it's, again, I think it's sad in a sense that, for instance, now Lego had to take a step of not advertising their cop Legos. And, just different. The Cops show. My husband has watched that for years. It's so interesting and informative. It really is. I don't like to sit down and really watch that stuff.
Or Paw Patrol.
Paw Patrol.
Paw Patrol. I didn't know that was going to be controversial.
So you just take the richness out of a culture and out of a society.
One of the questions I want to put on the table, because we're in the midst of a campaign. I think some of us noticed that. And all of a sudden, when you have Nancy Pelosi saying, I want to remove some of these statues from Statuary Hall, or two of the questions yesterday for Kelly McEnany were about whether or not to change the names of some of these bases, whether it should still be called Hood and a variety of others. If these were really burning issues, why didn't they surface when we had, for 8 years, an African-American president? We had an African-American attorney general, Eric Holder, then later Loretta Lynch, a variety of others. So it seems to me that those issues only are surfacing right now because we're in the midst of a presidential campaign, or am I just getting too cynical?
I don't know if it has to do with the presidential campaign or not, or if it has to do with there's always, especially in the House, and the House was designed to be the one that of the two legislative bodies that was quicker to react to public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Senate was supposed to be sort of where things kind of had time to cool off. So, like with a discussion with rushing to a vaccine, rushing to political decisions is not usually a good idea either.
Nope.
Nancy Pelosi has been in Congress for 32 years.
And this is now all of a sudden a big issue.
Right. And like Penna said, those statues are chosen by the states. You've been in Congress for 32 years. If it has bugged you this whole time, you had plenty of time to write, to address that with those states. Just because you're Speaker of the House doesn't give you any sort of special authority to remove those statues. The states decide who they want to honor in Statuary Hall. If those states now decide to honor somebody, that's their decision. And it's fine if the congresswoman from California doesn't like who the people of Virginia have decided to honor in Statuary Hall, or the people of Mississippi, or the people of Michigan, or anywhere else. But just because you're Speaker of the House, you don't get to decide who's memorialized in the U.S. Capitol.
Or whether or not you should change the name Fort Hood after all these years, or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and it's after all these years, I think, is an important point. I mean, you can go back and look at the context of when they did, what went into the decision to name that fort,
right.
Why they wanted to honor John Bell Hood. But certainly, since then, there's been a lot of history since then, and a lot of good things have come from that fort.
Of course.
And lots of others.
That's what the president said. And again, we were trying to have a discussion, as we did with Rasul Berry yesterday, about the issue of race, but these all seem to be just intended to be just kind of wedge issues during a political campaign. And like you said, if after 3 decades you finally go, wait a minute, we need to rename the forts, and we need to pull all these statues, why didn't we hear about that 8 years ago? Good question, at least. And
if you do, then what?
Yeah, what do
you
we
really do?
Yeah, what do we do in terms of improving race relations?
Bringing
about racial reconciliation.
A lot of things that are being tossed around, and this happens in Congress, it happens in the culture and sports and TV and lots of other things, is style over substance. It is to be seen doing something, like do something even if it is wrong. Like that's a lot of times, especially in the House, like I said, because they're up every 2 years, they're the body that reacts the quickest, and the Senate is usually where things take a little longer, and it was designed that way.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, Gary Bauer with us, and I'd love to get his thoughts about what is happening up in Seattle. And we've certainly got a couple of other pieces that he's pushed out in his end-of-day report, so we're going to take a break and hear from him right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, Penna Dexter in studio, Lathan Watts with us, and we now have a chance to talk with our friend Gary Bauer. Let me just mention, first of all, that we have information about his website, and I really do encourage you to support that organization. As they are coming to the end of their fiscal year, we wanted to feature them today. And in particular, Gary, we've spent some time, and let me just do a formal introduction. President of American Values, of course, served in Ronald Reagan's administration and a number of other things, but we've already already sort of talked about tearing down some of the statues and a variety of other issues, but we really have not talked about what you could call the Seattle occupiers or the Seattle secessionists. We just talked about secession a minute ago. And so this is the country of Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. I have a friend that was going to go to Seattle and said, do I need to bring my passport since it's an actual country? And we're trying to put some smile on this because this is crazy, but I'd love to get your thoughts about this new country in a 6-block area of Seattle called Chaz, and how even in the midst of that, they're still wanting to get rid of the mayor of Seattle. What are your thoughts?
Well, it is an amazing moment in America, isn't it? I'm almost at a loss for words, but with the emphasis on almost, I'll do my best here to take this on. No, it's outrageous, and some of the media is trying to make it sound like a joke. It's no big deal. It's a bunch of tofu vegans, sort of this decade's hippies, but actually there are some pretty nasty people that are part of this group that first took over a police precinct headquarters in Seattle when the city government ordered the police to evacuate that precinct building. And then once the rioters and the other folks out there in the streets took over the police precinct building, they expanded it. So, now, as you said, it's about 6 square blocks. Kerby, one of the things that jumped out at me, the first thing they did, these lefties, is they established a border. They put up blockades on all the streets so that nobody could get into Chaz that they didn't want to get in. That sounds like what they pilloried Donald Trump for doing, having our country have a border.
Great line.
And then they stationed armed guards at the border, which, again, they pilloried the president about doing. But think about this for a second. There are businesses inside that 6 square blocks. There are people who live there. They now have to get permission from this motley crew of anarchists, socialists, and Marxists to enter their own neighborhood, to go to their own business. They're not allowed to drive into the neighborhood. And the police chief of Seattle, who's an African-American woman, is quoted in the last 24 hours as saying that assaults, rapes, and other crimes are happening within that 6-block area, and the police department of Seattle cannot get in because the city won't allow them to go in.
Gary, it's Penna Dexter. Thanks for being with us. First of all, the TV pictures don't look like Earth people and vegetarians and vegans. They look like some pretty tough characters. And, as we've seen across the country with protests, there's an element then that takes advantage of it. And these are people not only of the far left, but very well trained, very efficient. It's sort of like a machine.
Yes.
Do you have any idea how much a part of this Antifa and these types of groups are in Chaz?
Yes. There's a sentence that, a couple of years ago, we wouldn't even know what that meant. Antifa groups in Chaz, huh?
Really, we've got some new words here, new terminology.
Yes. Well, I just saw a report that there are both Antifa and then elements of Black Lives Matter Incorporated, as distinguished from Black Lives Matter as a concept. Of course, Black Lives Matter, but there is a group that has been promoting that slogan, and that is a very radical group. So both that group and Antifa is in Chaz, and apparently there's some disputes that are broken out between them. I don't know if it's over who's going to run the place or whatever, but the one thing I know is if there's a dispute, neither of those warring parties are going to call the police because they both agree the police should not be in Chaz. It does make you want to laugh. On the other hand, we should remember that these nutty things that start on the West Coast tend to roll downhill to the rest of the country. And I would not be surprised if the governor and the mayor of Seattle continue to let this go on, that we will see similar efforts pop up in other major American U.S. cities.
Yeah, I fear that also. And, we have a list of the demands of these people in this Chaz country. Mm-hmm. And, it's really no in law enforcement. As a matter of fact, it's no, even the idea of anything being a crime is, yes. So many items on this list point to that. So all of a sudden, nothing's a crime, nothing is good, nothing is bad. Black Lives Matter, one of their pieces, one of their demands is to basically, instead of the family, the nuclear family, you have villages raising people. I mean, this is all basically tyrannical, totalitarian ideas that we've fought ever since we've been a nation.
It's a great summary, Penna. And while it doesn't fit the narrative, I know everybody on our show today, on your show, Kerby, is we care about what's happening in the black community. I know I've worked a lot, and you all have too, on the issue of strengthening the black family, because it's very hard to defeat some of the intractable problems in minority communities if you can't restore the norm of children being raised by mothers and fathers. The research on this is absolutely, it's virtually unanimous. And yet here you have a group that claims it's speaking for those minority communities, but they're attacking the normative family of a mother and father raising children. That's just insane. And it shows that there's another agenda here. I'm afraid that race is being used to divide Americans, and then further, the issue of race is being used to advance a radical social and political agenda that will hurt everybody in the country, and certainly will hurt minority communities in many cases worse than anybody else.
One of the things that we wanted to feature is, of course, what you make available at American Values. And just the other day in your end-of-day report, which I've always said is a must-read for everyone, you mentioned the fact that there have been some that have tried to do what they can to reach out, and it's been removed or it's been rebuffed, depending on which situation you have. We have the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Fry, who gets in front of these groups and is broken and crying, but the moment he says, I'm really not about defunding the police, they said, then go home, Jacob, go home, shame, shame, shame. Well, actually, they said some things I can't say on radio, but you know what I'm getting at. Then you mentioned in your end-of-day report the mayor in Washington, D.C., trying to reach out with a block, which she called Black Lives Matter Plaza, puts Black Lives Matter in yellow letters, and instead they accuse her of tokenism and then take over another block and put in huge letters, defund the police. And then as we're going to a break, let me just mention the Seattle mayor. I'll get your comments after the break.
Sure.
Because you have the Seattle mayor, Jenny Durkin, who has really just backed off from any kind of attempt to deal with this issue at all. When the last time somebody took over a facility, I think Bill Clinton was in office, and you had an attorney general that finally decided to go in and do something about that, Janet Reno. But anyway, has said, no, I can't go in there and do anything either. And so then they march into the city hall and they want to get rid of her. So one of the things I learned this week, Gary, from your end-of-day report is no matter how much you try to appease the radical left, it doesn't work. And of course, that also gets to the op-ed page editor of the New York Times, J.K. Rowling, Ellen DeGeneres, and some of those. So when we come come back from the break, Gary, first of all, I want to promote your end-of-day report. But number two,
Thank you.
Just get your thoughts about the fact that doesn't this almost look like the French Revolution where you just can't be radical enough? So Gary Bauer with us. We have in studio with us Lathan Watts and Penna Dexter. We'll get back to his comments in just a minute. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about Gary Bauer, we have a link to, again, ouramericanvalues.org. We'll be back right after this.
Some colleges and universities have decided to stop using the SAT and ACT exams to make admissions decisions. The largest system to make such an announcement is the University of California. Its size and prestige will certainly influence others. The Wall Street Journal's Jason Riley says that's unfortunate because low-income minorities have more to lose than gain from the end of standardized testing. One critique is that test questions contain cultural bias that would make it harder for racial and ethnic minorities or low-income applicants to do well. For example, of 4 possible comparisons, runner is to marathon best parallels the relationship of oarsman to regatta. SAT critics contend that such a question discriminates, since an inner-city student would be less likely than a white kid from an upscale community to know that a regatta is a boat race. Another complaint is that low-income students are less likely to take prep courses. The Journal's Jason Riley, who is black, points out, questions that depend on exposure to white privilege are rare, not typical. Factors like study habits, time spent reading books versus watching television, the size and complexity of vocabulary a student is exposed to growing up, and the quality of elementary school that student attended are behind the racial and ethnic disparities in scores. A family's wealth provides advantages, but as University of Virginia sociologist W. Bradford Wilcox points out, when it comes to who will succeed in college, the most privileged students are those from intact families. The SAT is actually a good way to identify kids from difficult backgrounds who have academic potential. Blacks and Hispanics do score lower on average than whites and Asians on these tests. It may be taboo to mention it, but fatherlessness is the primary reason for the achievement gap. The SAT and ACT tests are not the problem. Getting rid of them will only paper over and obscure this reality, and do nothing to change it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes. Gary Bauer, of course, is the head of American Values. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link to ouramericanvalues.org. I support that organization. I encourage you to do so. And as they're coming to their fiscal year end, I know they would appreciate your financial support. We have in studio with us Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts. But I put on the table some of these individuals who thought, well, by going in the direction of the radical left, that would appease them. And what I am seeing, especially after reading your end-of-day report that came out just the other day on Monday, was that you just can't appease some of the radicals because no matter what you do, it just never is enough.
Well, it's a great summary you gave, Kerby. You're absolutely right, and the analogy to the French Revolution was correct too. I mean, real revolutions, and I think we're experiencing or seeing something in our own country like a real revolution, ends up ultimately, when it's not grounded in anything that is meaningful, our own American revolution was grounded in the idea that liberty comes from God and that only a virtuous people can remain free. This revolutionary fervor is grounded on Marxist ideas, a form of anarchism, all sorts of other things, and it ultimately does turn on itself. So, there's been a long list of liberal heroes in the last couple of weeks that suddenly have found themselves under attack by the left-wing mobs on social media because they picked a wrong phrase or a word that's now out or has a different connotation than it originally did. Saying something as simple as, well, I'm against police brutality. That's a statement that 90% at least of America would agree with. But let's certainly recognize that most policemen don't engage in brutality. That will cause the roof to cave in on you if you make that obvious observation too, which some liberals have made. So, yes, we're seeing these far-left elected officials suddenly find out that to the new woke crowd, these new socialists in government are now old fogies that can't be trusted. So I did think, Kirby, there's also an irony here. I mean, Seattle has basically separated itself from the United States in recent years. Seattle refuses to cooperate with federal government officials to track down illegal immigrants, even ones that have been accused of major crimes. And they thought that was a really cool, progressive thing to say we're not going to follow federal laws. Now here comes a group of people within Seattle that says, guess what, Mayor? We're not going to follow Seattle's laws. We're going to carve out a part of Seattle where we will only have the laws that we want. So once you unleash these kinds of forces on the radical left, there's no stopping it.
Mr. Bauer, this is Lathan Watts from First Liberty Institute.
Hey,
I wanted to pick up on a comment that you made earlier about this being a sort of revolution here. And I think Kerby's analysis of the French Revolution and the analogy is an apt one. But I think and tell me what you think, especially about the situation in Seattle, because it's very much when you get down to what they say they want, it's a Marxist revolution. Yeah. And so I think what the mayor there and some of the politicians on the left are discovering, Marx himself didn't like socialists. He said they watered down the revolution. And I've always said that socialism is the communist starter kit. And so I think that what the left-wing mayor and governor there are experiencing is what happened in the original Marxist revolution. And to a degree, what you see here is you may be left, but you're not left enough.
Yeah, not Marxist enough. What about that?
That's a great analysis. And look, I think we always take a risk, right, when we start talking about, well, this is communism, this is a Marxist philosophy. You get a lot of people today that will go, okay, well, now you're just talking crazy. But in fact, when you start looking at the actual manifestos that these organizations put out, what their demands are, once you get past the managed news of our fake media, you find out very quickly that this is a really revolutionary, radical agenda that no one in America that really cares about the country, no matter what our races are, could ever embrace, because it would mean the destruction of the United States as we know it. So yes, it's a revolutionary time, and the tactics that are being used are revolutionary tactics. And one of the things, by the way, when there's a revolution, what happens in countries when there's a revolution? Statues and monuments to the old regime are destroyed. This is the way the revolutionary mob shows that it's a new day. They're now in control. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the streets of America increasingly. And I would just remind everybody, if you need a reminder, that President Trump several years ago predicted exactly this when there was a dispute in Virginia about taking down a Robert E. Lee statue. He said, look, there's good people on both sides of that debate about the Robert E. Lee statue, but don't forget, if that statue is taken down, it won't stop there. They'll go after our founding fathers. And what happened in Washington, D.C. last week? The Lincoln Memorial was attacked. The Jefferson Memorial was defaced. And now there's demands to take down the statues of America's founders.
Gary, we only have a couple of minutes, and we thank you so much for being with us. You have so much wisdom. I want to just ask about what we do because, I've noticed this week that we're able to begin to get people to differentiate between the idea of Black Lives Matter, which is true, and the organization. You made that statement, and people are starting to see that. So there's things that we can say that are simple to help change the argument. But what else how can we, with the anarchy going across the country, now with a new country in Seattle, how can we fight against this? Because when the president said, I'm going to bring in the military to stop some of this, that, in a sense, I think it was a deterrent to some degree, but it's not happening now. He's kind of had to pull back on that idea. What do we do? What does the right do? What do the freedom-loving Americans do?
And I've got about 2 minutes, right?
You've got about a minute now. I'm going to talk too much.
How to save the country in 2 minutes. No, look, it's the right question to ask. I hope I don't disappoint your listeners with my answer. Look, start at home. I really think we're seeing the results of a couple of decades now of anti-American history being taught. So
yes.
A lot of people in this atmosphere are afraid to go out into the public square and start saying the right things. Say the right things at your dinner table. Find some good books, like books by Bill Bennett and others that allow you to talk to your children. Look at the history books that are in your school's classroom to see what's being taught. Help your own children and grandchildren overcome what literally, without any exaggeration, is becoming an indoctrination in the popular culture and in the schools that teaches America is evil, that America is racist to its core. If we can't save our kids, the rest of the efforts we make will be to no avail.
One other action point, I would encourage you to support American Values. It's ouramericanvalues.org. Gary Bauer, it's always great to have you on the program.
Thank you. Always great to be with you.
We'll be back right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. On this particular hour, we're going to spend some time taking some of your phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts with us. And again, Lathan is the Director of Public Affairs for First Liberty Institute. We've posted one of his pieces on religious liberty. We have a couple of other columns and articles here about removing statues, about some of the cancel culture, the country of Chaz in Seattle, and much, much more. Before I take some phone calls, though, and some have been waiting a while, Penna, it might be worth coming back to a point that Lathan made just a minute ago when we were talking with Gary Bauer, and that is when I look over the demands from Seattle, or even more recently, I was looking over the demands from Fort Worth, Dallas, a variety of other places, San Antonio. There's a lot of similarity, and of course they start with defunding the police. And we can talk about what that means in just a minute, because one of our callers wants to talk about that. But then abolishing the courts, abolishing imprisonment, getting rid of the prisons, banning evictions, socialized medicine, basically destroying the nuclear family, reparations. I mean, that's a list that even Bernie Sanders would say, yeah, that's a little bit more than I'm ready to call for. So there are some radical statements being made, and I think it's worth mentioning one more time. I feel like I've said it all week. There is a fundamental difference between the idea of the Black Lives Matter as a hashtag and the Black Lives Matter movement, because if you go to that website, you're going to see some things, I would think, as a Christian, that you say, I'm just not so sure I'm all for. And some people make their peace by saying, well, sometimes I don't agree with everything a candidate says. Maybe, but I've had a lot of people say, I had no idea that that's kind of the agenda that I'm sort of endorsing when I use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, or when I go to a Black Lives Matter event, and then I'm told to actually sign up to support that organization.
Well, I've seen, just as this has been taking place over the last couple of weeks, I've seen Christian parents dealing with young people who, they're posting support for Black Lives Matter. They're raising money for Black Lives Matter because in their minds, their uninformed minds, Black Lives Matter, which, okay, that's
yes,
a great sentiment. But they haven't seen the list that we've got here in front of us about the demands in Chaz, or this week, I know you discussed the 10 reasons that Ryan Baumberger, who's half African American, it was a wonderful piece that he wrote, and also some other reasons Christians should not support Black Lives Matter, because it's a socialist, progressive, Marxist agenda. And so, we've got to double down and articulate the difference, because even in churches, in Christian families, in corporations, in the media, there's tremendous confusion. And I'm glad that Gary said, start with your family, because really it's tearing families apart right now. It's tearing churches apart. It's tearing groups of friends apart. And, it's a pretty simple truth to be able to. And I've also seen some successes where people have been persuaded when they understand, when they look at the lists of demands of that organization. So, wow, it came upon us. It really didn't come upon us quickly, but this part of it did. And we don't have much time before more destruction's done. We have to disabuse people of the notion that this is a good and benevolent concept.
Certainly, if you go back and look at pictures of some of the marches in the civil rights movement, some of the marches that Dr. King led, you'll see a lot of American flags being carried by the people marching. They were using what is best about America, the promise that here, it doesn't matter who your father was, it doesn't matter what you look like, you're not bound to a certain destiny because you were born to this class of people. They were using that promise and that flag and what it represented to sort of stir the conscience of the nation. So you are not living up to this promise.
Right.
But they appealed to what was best about America to get it done. And that's why it got done. That's why we had the Civil Rights Act. That's why things changed.
Yeah.
What the difference now is what you were seeing in some of these places like Chaz in Seattle and some of these other protests that end up because of bad elements within the crowd becoming violent and other things. You don't see American flags.
No.
You might see one on fire, but you don't see them appealing to the founding and the good idea to make the change. What they're actually trying to do is in the case of some of these, violently tear down the institutions that make this possible, because you cannot replace with the Marxist ideal until you destroy the institutions that are currently in place. And that's what Mr. Bauer was talking about.
Sure. And we talked about it this week with Dinesh D'Souza, the United States of Socialism, identity socialism, and all that. But one of those demands is the idea of defunding the police. But let's, if we can, go to Kay. I think it's in Maine. And I think your family worked in law enforcement. How can we begin to address some of the issues that are on the table about police brutality and other issues, Kay?
Well, this is just something I'd like to share. My husband's a federal officer, and my brother-in-law is a retired assistant chief of police, and neither of them ever engaged in what went on in Minnesota. I think what it is if people would start to look at it, not a skin color an issue, in as much as it is a corruption and a lack of integrity in certain cops that should not be cops. But just as much as there are bad cops that don't have integrity and don't understand about not carrying their biases over into their functions as a police officer, there are wonderful, fabulous cops that are retired that are standing in the bylines that right now they want to help. So what if America was to pull on all local and federal and city officers who are either retired or still on the force from police departments that don't have issues, that historically don't have issues with police brutality or racism or corruption in their ranks, and let these officers come together in one large group, and then let them bring their wonderful knowledge and experience together and brainstorm, and let the government of the United States back them and fund them to do this and bring them all together, and then divide the country into West Coast, East Coast, and your middle states, and make sure those officers that when you break up that large group into smaller groups, that they have people from small departments on each team, large departments on each team, and older officers and younger officers, so that you get a wealth of experience on each of the smaller teams, and send those smaller teams into the departments across America that have problems with corruption, because we need to restore faith in the integrity of our police officers, because there are wonderful police officers out there, and without some type of police force that has the ability to differentiate and what's going on when they're investigating crimes, and those officers that have and hold true to the integrity of what they are doing for America, our entire United States will become a place of chaos, like we have never seen. And so we need our officers to be supported, and we need this group of officers to come and help. So,
let's take a break, and if you want to stay over, we'll get some more comments from you. But when we come back, we'll continue our conversation about what we can do to deal with this issue of law enforcement. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
George Barna has been doing an extensive inventory of worldviews in America through the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. He was on my radio program last week to talk about two of his most recent surveys dealing with truth and morality. Now, past generations of Americans viewed God as the basis of truth. Not only has that changed for the general population, it has also changed significantly within the church. He found that there are certain groups that rejected the idea of absolute truth. That would be members of the LGBTQ community, political liberals, spiritual skeptics, Democrats, and young people under the age of 50. By contrast, those most likely to see God as the basis of truth are the group called SageCons. That stands for Spiritually Active, Governance-Engaged Conservative Christians. Nearly 9 out of 10 point to God as the source of truth. More than 6 in 10 recognize the existence of absolute moral standards. In his next report, he decided to see how we apply moral principles in real-life situations. The questions ranged from telling a white lie to failing to pay back a loan to speeding to abortion. It was troubling to see what percentage of Americans felt that some of these behaviors were not even a moral issue. In some cases, a significant percentage might have believed it was a moral issue, but it was morally acceptable in today's society. Another troubling finding was what Barna calls a seismic shift in Christian views about morality. For example, born-again Christians in the survey were 3 times as likely to say they rely on the Bible for primary moral guidance, but less than half actually do so. The latest Barna surveys are a reminder to pastors and other Christian teachers that we need to make the case for moral absolutes based on God's Word. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And we have Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts. And we still have Kay on the line. I thought it would be important to just remind us that the individual who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, of course, has been arrested and has been charged with second-degree murder. But if you look at his file, there are 18 different complaints against him, 2 which were reprimands. The individual that is now one of the accomplices, he had 6, which actually resulted in a court case against the city of Minneapolis and another one that's outstanding. So I've heard even more recently, the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Fry, was on just last week pointing out that because of these police unions, sometimes even when they wanted to fire a police officer, they would take it to court and get them back on this force. So what I hear you saying, Kay, is you're going to get some bad apples, as the president mentioned yesterday. You're going to get some individuals. There may be some corruption, and you're suggesting maybe we get the best and the brightest and have a national conversation and then break into different parts of the country so that we can take the, if you will, best principles and apply that to the police force in the future. Is that kind of a quick summary of what you've said?
Absolutely. And, you know, I will tell you, I don't think that using the military in this instance is quite really a good idea. I'm prior military myself, and having been around law enforcement for so long, law enforcement in America, they engage the American public in ways that military, whether National Guard or active duty, could never really have the knowledge or the experience to engage the American public with. They have such wonderful tools that they've gained from from years of interacting with American citizens in many different situations that military personnel do not have. And if we really, I mean, my brother-in-law right now, he's just beside himself. If he was called up right now and asked to be part of this, he would volunteer. He's told me this. My husband's the same way, and there's many, many other wonderful, wonderful officers that are willing to do this. And I hope that the American public does not become deceived in believing that the defunding and disbanding police departments is going to afford them some type of new, better protection, because you will end up with some type of enforcers on the ground if you defund your police departments and disband them. And it's not going to be a good one, because right now, if you create a new set of enforcers to replace your police, they're going to be coming in with biases of their own, and it's never going to address the problem. But by pulling on our wonderful, experienced, knowledgeable, clean officers, they can come in and help their country, and believe me, they really want to help their country right now.
You know, right now, Tim Scott, who is a senator from South Carolina, has been tapped to head up the effort in the Senate to get a bill, a reform bill for police that competes with the one that the Democrats are talking about in the House. So Tim Scott is the senator from South Carolina, and then the others that are developing this legislation is Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, also Ben Sass of Nebraska, James Lankford of Oklahoma, John Cornyn of Texas, and Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. I'm thinking perhaps it would be wise of you to kind of put your ideas on paper and get it to that group of legislators, because you've got some good ideas there, and just help their thinking a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. And feel free to pass those ideas on to somebody if you can quickly pass them on.
I think the best thing to do would be what I just said that you should do, because you're going to articulate it beautifully.
Okay, I will do that. You said Tim Scott?
Yeah, Tim Scott is the head of it. He'd probably be the one to send it to his office, write it up really well, and send it in.
I surely will do that. And thank you so very much for the time to speak.
Well, again, we always appreciate our callers that bring a lot to the table. And I want to move on to some other issues. But while we're talking about police for just a minute, I gave you the number of complaints against these individuals. And there was an originally kind of response that I got from one of the sheriffs saying, well, yeah, but you can get in a complaint sometimes because you were nasty to someone or whatever. Well, then some people actually began to post what those complaints were, and they were significant. Were all of them enough to fire an individual, take him off the police force? Maybe not. But the fact is that they, if you listen to the video, I'd not picked this up until I saw this the other day. They were calling out his badge number. And I forget what it was. Let's just say it was 1806, something like that. And he says, hey, that's badge 1806. And everybody's like, they know the badge. So these people know this guy hasn't been good. So let me come to you for just a minute, Lathan. The estimate I heard the other day from one of the people in the police union is we have 375 million interactions between police officers and citizens every single year. I don't know if that includes those that pull us over because we're driving too fast or not, but nevertheless, those are numbers. It helps understand that in some respects, when we hear about whether it's Michael Brown or whether it's George Floyd or it's all sorts of other list of individuals that we can talk about, these really are a very, very small fraction of a percent compared to all the interactions with the police, aren't they?
Yes. Based on the data that I've seen and the statistics like you've just talked about, one of the challenges is sometimes the facts don't seem to matter. When someone is angry enough, confronting them with facts doesn't you don't get anywhere.
That's right.
But from a policy making standpoint, yes, that should be taken into account. Every time it happens, it's a tragedy. The fact that it's a minuscule number is not, stating that it is not a way of diminishing how bad those interactions are. What happened to George Floyd outrages me on a level I can't truly even put into words, because to me that's the worst abuse of power imaginable. That is the people we trust to protect us responsible for the death of an innocent human being. And it doesn't get worse than that in a free society. And every time something like that happens, it must be dealt with. It's impossible to eliminate it altogether because we are dealing with human beings. The people who put the uniform on and wear a badge and carry a gun are human beings. They are fallible human beings. And you can't eliminate it altogether. That doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to minimize it to the most degree that you can. Mm-hmm. And there's going to have to be some things probably put in place that helps rebuild the idea of trusting local law enforcement. That's sad to me. I mean, my father-in-law is retired Dallas PD. I've got friends from college that are in federal law enforcement. It's sad to me that people need to have trust rebuilt, but I understand that in some areas it really, really does need to be rebuilt. That it has to be done at a local level. There's no one magic bullet, silver, solution that you can come up with a top-down, this one thing is going to fix everything everywhere in America. Every community is different because it's made up of different individuals. And those local police departments are going to have to figure out for themselves the best way to go about reestablishing trust in that community. I think one way you can do it is to hire locally. And I mean, there's lots of police departments, and right here in Dallas is one of them, that are, according to the police chief, woefully understaffed. They need more officers and recruit local. The kid that grew up there.
And by the way, that's one of the things that they've been talking about that would be good because they know the community.
Yeah. Exactly. I think
instead
another thing
of from outside.
Yeah, exactly. I think
that's another positive
is when there is a complaint or a series of complaints, because like you said, I mean, I could get a ticket and not like the look on the guy's face who gave me the ticket and file a complaint.
Yeah. So
but
you have to look at the ones that are very egregious.
Exactly. And
are letters of reprimand and all sorts of things.
Right. And if it rises to the level of something that needs to be investigated, having some sort of objective third party look at it as well. I think when you have sort of any organization that's going to sort of investigate itself, people get suspicious of that.
Yeah.
That's
why they talk about citizens groups and things like that.
Right.
And that's another positive we can talk about.
But if you're going to do something like that, you need people, maybe it is like the previous caller, retired from law enforcement, who understand, both sides of that dynamic, not just, somebody who really, really cares about this issue. Well, that's great, but do you know anything about this issue? Like, there are things that are going to have to be done. I think it needs to be localized because police is local.
Yeah. Well, and again, you can see some of these hot spots. Minneapolis is one of those. Philandro Castile was killed. You have George Floyd was killed. I can mention some others. So sometimes just locally isn't enough. You maybe need somebody from the outside coming in and saying, we need to solve a problem here because it's happened more than once. But let's take a break. We'll take some of your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Penna Dexter, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And I certainly do encourage you, if you would like to find out a little bit more. We have posted quite a number of articles today. We spent some time actually in one of our local hours talking about the piece by Lathan Watts on religious freedom, but I think you'd like to read that. We have one on what's called the cancel counter, and that is how many individuals have found themselves in trouble, the so-called cancel culture, and individuals getting in trouble for just saying basic information, or for individuals that wanted to remove statues that are actually ones that should have been lauded by Black Lives Matter. We, of course, have one on the removing the statues from the Capitol. Nancy Pelosi promoting that. After 3 decades, she finally said, maybe that's a problem, which we've already sort of gotten into. And then we have the country of Chaz in Seattle, in case you want to know about that. But let's take some phone calls. We've been talking about, of course, the police force and a number of other issues. We've also talked about history. So let me go to Lucy in Georgia. I think you want to talk about that as well. Give us some background, if you might.
Hi. I'm just a believer, and I listen to your radio station sometimes. And I just happened to get in the car today, and I was listening to the gentleman talking about history and about people reading. Sometimes we don't know things because we're not reading. And I don't know anywhere near as much as what you all have been talking about. I don't know all of it. Sometimes it's difficult to listen and watch all of it. It's so hurtful sometimes to see the things that are happening in our nation.
Very true.
But I do know, in terms of believers, the saddest thing for me as a believer is to see the relationships between Christians, regardless of the race, and to see the breakdown. And when I was listening to the gentleman make that comment about, at least some of these people just read a book, I understand what you're saying. And then he made a statement and said he loves history. But sometimes I wonder, is the problem is that we love all these things, but we don't do a good job of loving one another or having just mercy. It seems like something simple, but we don't listen to each other. We just paint a broad stroke, and we decide that the entire white race is like this and the entire black race is like this. And so many people watch the way we behave one to another. And sometimes when we're trying to talk to bridge things, we can be self-righteous and belittling to others. And so it's difficult for people to listen. Because I get it, if you know all this stuff about history. I'm just beginning to find out the last couple of years things about history, things that I didn't know, Christian believers. And so I'm beginning to find out all those things. And I don't begrudge believers that are not African American. But it was nice to find out, okay, this gentleman or this lady did this, and she was a believer. But I think, the monuments and all of that stuff, there's other things. It's the relationships with one another.
Sure. And again, I get the idea about relationships. One of the things that Pastor Tony Evans has said, and he's been on the program a number of times, he's going to be on with us again, is if we can't get the church organized, why can we expect anything else in the culture to be organized? So God's still going to work in the church house before he works in the state house. And so, relationships, loving, being good citizens, civility, graciousness. Even yesterday when we were talking with Rasul Berry, We talked about how important it is to listen, and nothing else. I would hope that we would begin to come together as believers in the church and make a positive impact in society. So I think that's kind of what Lucy's talking about today.
And I think what's happened is there's just so little listening going on right now that it's almost unbelievable on both sides, really. But I think you have to listen, but you also have to have enough courage to speak the truth. And I think there are ways to speak it too that we could learn. She said something about feeling like we knew everything, and there always has to be an openness to learn something new, I think.
That's right.
And I'm trying to, in my old age, trying to get better at that. But I also, if you study, if you know some facts, if you've learned, you should not be discounted by people who have not done that yet. So, like the historical knowledge that I just learned from Lathan, people need to respect someone that studied something and know it. And right now you're not hearing any of that either. Mm-hmm. And, in churches, I think, we could have a little bit more of that. We definitely could.
She said something else in passing I'd like to pick up on, because we did talk about it earlier in the week, and that is just the incredible legacy that Christians have had in history. Because she said, I found out that person was a Christian. Just a minute ago, I was talking about, of course, how one of these monuments was defaced in Philadelphia, which the man was an abolitionist and all of the rest. And earlier in the week, we talked about this book, Dominion, which is actually written by Tom Holland. Now, he's an atheist, but he, as an individual that's been studying history for years, finally said, I got to change my mind. Even though I'm an atheist, Christianity has made a profound impact in Western civilization. It has elevated the role of women. It has really, in many cases, given us Western civilization. And so I ordered the book. It's going to take me some time to get through that book. But whether it is Rodney Stark, who's looking at that from a Christian point of view, the triumph of Christianity, whether it's, in this case, Tom Holland, who's an atheist. Even the other day, Richard, a couple of individuals, some of these people that are actually part of the so-called new atheists, Richard Dawkins, I was going to say, even sort of begrudgingly said, actually we're probably better because of religion in general, maybe even Christianity in particular. Those are things that we need to emphasize, because if all you were to know is what your liberal Marxist professor said, you would think that Christianity is responsible for nothing other than the Salem witch trials and the Inquisition, right?
Let me suggest something, because, she mentioned reading, and a lot of people, we have busy lives, and it's hard to get through a lot of books in your life sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so for people in that category, or who just don't love reading, then use your ears and listen. And my goodness, Kerby, you read a lot of books. And I'm going to host on Wednesday, and I'm going to bring the authors of 2 books in and talk about their books. So you can get the ideas by listening to Point of View 2 hours a day. You can bring a lot of wisdom into your life and heart, and you can also get it, the idea that God is the author of wisdom. And so you're getting it in from that perspective. So I would recommend listening to Point of View and getting friends who perhaps you're not able to persuade them of some of the wisdom of some of these positions, but get them to start listening.
Yeah, and I hope Lucy is still listening, because I don't want anything that I said to inadvertently hurt anyone's feelings. What I said about please pick up a book was specifically about people in Boston who defaced a monument to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was an all African-American regiment that fought to free the slaves in the Civil War. And even before I started, I think that comment, or maybe another one, hopefully I said, I don't claim to be an expert in history. I said I love history because I do. I think you can learn so much from history, and that in looking back with hindsight is a lot of times how we learn things. And so looking back over history, take the lessons from history so that you don't make the same mistakes again, and apply the lessons of history to whether it's conversation now or policy discussions now, so that those mistakes aren't repeated. So I don't, information is more accessible right now than at any point in human history. So I get some schools are better than others. That's a sad fact, but it's the case. And if you or your children are not being served well during the time that they're at school, then you're going to have to find a way to do it outside of those hours. There's lots of resources available for people. Free. I mean, there's more information available right now than there ever has been. Now, it takes critical thinking and critical reading to know if what you're reading is fact or opinion, but it's out there and you can help.
Let's take a break. We'll take a phone call or two before we end the program today. And if you'd like to find some of the things we've been mentioning, they're available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Some colleges and universities have decided to stop using the SAT and ACT exams to make admissions decisions. The largest system to make such an announcement is the University of California. Its size and prestige will certainly influence others. The Wall Street Journal's Jason Riley says that's unfortunate because low-income minorities have more to lose than gain from the end of standardized testing. One critique is that test questions contain cultural bias that would make it harder for racial and ethnic minorities or low-income applicants to do well. For example, of 4 possible comparisons, runner is to marathon best parallels the relationship of oarsman to regatta. SAT critics contend that such a question discriminates, since an inner-city student would be less likely than a white kid from an upscale community to know that a regatta is a boat race. Another complaint is that low-income students are less likely to take prep courses. The Journal's Jason Riley, who is black, points out, questions that depend on exposure to white privilege are rare, not typical. Factors like study habits, time spent reading books versus watching television, the size and complexity of vocabulary a student is exposed to growing up, and the quality of elementary school that student attended are behind the racial and ethnic disparities in scores. A family's wealth provides advantages, but as University of Virginia sociologist W. Bradford Wilcox points out, when it comes to who will succeed in college, the most privileged students are those from intact families. The SAT is actually a good way to identify kids from difficult backgrounds who have academic potential. Blacks and Hispanics do score lower on average than whites and Asians on these tests. It may be taboo to mention it, but fatherlessness is the primary reason for the achievement gap. The SAT and ACT tests are not the problem. Getting rid of them will only paper over and obscure this reality, and do nothing to change it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that Penna Dexter's commentary today is one that we have just been playing, and I would encourage you to read it. It's all about scrapping the SAT. And if you have not signed up to receive the Viewpoints commentaries, you can do so, and you'll receive mine Monday through Friday. And I always love to see Penna show up in my inbox on Saturday. So that is the case. But I just thought before we run out of time, and we have more callers than we have time, we do have an election taking place here. And yesterday I posted posted some pieces one by Matt Schlapp, who is the chairman of the American Conservative Union, and he gave us 5 ways in which he thought America would take a hard left turn under Joe Biden. I won't go through all of those, but the point he was making is that in some cases when you vote for a candidate, you don't really know where they stand. Barack Obama had been a senator only for a very short period of time. We didn't know where he would necessarily come down, although we had a pretty good idea. We certainly didn't necessarily know where Donald Trump was because he had been a businessman. He hadn't been politically involved. But when you have somebody who's been a senator for 35 years and a vice president for 8 years, you know a little bit more. So I thought I'll come to you for just a minute, Lathan, because we have, of course, a presidential election. We have 34 U.S. Senate elections. We have 435 elections for the House of Representatives. We have, I think it's 13 governors' races, as well as all sorts of races for state and local governments. So I think somebody figured out about 35,000 different elections taking place by November. It's really important right now, especially with all this turmoil, to pay attention to what these candidates want to do. And if nothing else, I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden was initially postured as the moderate. And it has become unbelievably so. As a matter of fact, they even talk about how even the New York Times and others have said he's kind of had an interesting kind of flip-flop on things like abortion, the Hyde Amendment, things like that. So we're going to have a chance to really see if we can rectify some of these problems by some of these elections, right?
Well, always. I mean, that's the beauty of living in this country. You always have a chance to give somebody else a shot. And just like you said, I mean, there are elections all up and down the ballot. I served in, local government. I've served 4 years on city council. I can tell you, city elections are woefully attended or participated in.
That's right.
Most people don't pay attention to what's going on in local elections. But those local elections matter. I mean, they set your local tax rate. Those county elections matter. They set your county. Their school board elections matter. You look at, here in Texas, you get the property tax bill for your house. The biggest chunk of it is going to the school district. Mm-hmm. Elections always matter. Elections always have consequences. And I think it is a duty of people who live in a free and civil society that we do. And it is a blessing from God to live in a country as free as ours, where we have the right to participate and decide who governs us. That being a good steward of that blessing means being an informed voter. And if nothing else, there's going to be lots of uninformed voters. So try to balance one of them out. If you're an
or
informed
more, bring
voter,
your whole family.
Right. And it's a requirement, as far as I'm concerned, as a citizen and living in a free republic, to cast an informed vote. Not just this guy's got this letter by his name, so he must be good or must be bad. Make an educated decision.
Yeah. And I might just mention next week, Penna is going to be on Wednesday. Thursday is Millennial Roundtable. But on Tuesday, I have an individual that's with iVoterGuide.com, which is one of the resources we're going to make available, because sometimes you say, well, I think I know where the president stands or where his opponent stands. I may know where my senator stands, if indeed you are one of those states that has a senatorial election, maybe your representative. But by the time you work your way down, you really need information. We're going to try to provide as much of that as we can.
They go pretty deep. I want to get back to local elections real quick. Just think of what's happening right now in cities across the nation and how much what the mayor and who the mayor is or who the city council is matters right now. And, for instance, the city council in Minneapolis is the one that voted to defund the police.
Yep.
So, and the mayor is pretty ineffective in the problems they've had there. So it really matters. And I think the people getting, as far as Biden goes, the people that are getting the most attention in the Democrat Party is the hard left. And since he is where he is with just declining abilities, that's who's going to be in control. He's already appointed AOC, for instance, to head up his, climate initiative or whatever. So you are going to get hard left policies. Bernie Sanders has made a lot of inroads with the Biden campaign to be able to inject his issues. And so it's going to be, I mean, if Biden ends up our president, the country will just take leaps to the left. People need to remember that.
And also who the vice president would be. I've really tried to be careful because you don't want to ever really make fun of Joe Biden. But one of these days, I've heard a string of comments he's made, and they're getting worse and worse. So it's always been important to kind of know who your vice presidential candidate is. This may be the most important pick ever, don't you think?
It certainly could. Just the amateur observer of Biden, even he doesn't look as good as he did just even a few years ago. I think age is taking a toll on him, and that's a factor. It was a factor in Ronald Reagan's election. He joked about it in his first election. He wasn't going to make fun of his opponent's youth and inexperience, but it was a factor. People had concerns about electing somebody Reagan's age. Biden will be older than Reagan was.
That is true.
If he's elected. So, yes, a lot of times the VP selection is not, the most exciting thing in the world, but this cycle in the Democratic Party, it's where a lot of the attention is. Yeah. Because they have, sort of settled on their nominee. It's going to be a very interesting next few months, and also campaigning in the pandemic. What does campaigning look like?
It's going to be
could be a very unique election.
Penna, you will be on the show on Wednesday, and you can have some great guests coming in, don't you?
Well, I think you all ought to listen on Wednesday. Anthony DeStefano, who's a New York Times best-selling author, has written a book on hell. What is hell? And, some people think that we're experiencing it here on Earth and across the country, but really, truly, what is it? It's a real phenomenon. It's real. And so it's just sort of the Christian orthodoxy on that will be good. And, a lot more. We're going to have news in the show, too. So I appreciate the opportunity to come in.
It would be a great opportunity. Wednesday. And we'll have Penna and Kelly on Friday. And Lathan, it's just been great to see you. You were
good to be back.
in an ICU. So now it's nice to see you vertical. And if you want to read some very good articles by Lathan Watts, the first one we have linked, and then you can follow that link to First Liberty. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that if Kelly were sitting there right now, he'd say, we really need our financial support before the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. So support First Liberty. Penna, you and I support First Liberty, right? So we believe in the organization. We're not asking you listening to do anything other than what we do. So it's just been great to have you here as well. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to hear some of this again, you can go to the website and click that button, and it says listen. If you'd like to watch it, of course, it is also available there, and it'll be on the YouTube channel. And if you find yourself saying, well, I want to read what Lathan had to say about religious liberty, or you've been talking about this new country of Chaz in Seattle, that's the first I've heard about it. What's going on? And I'd like to see some of those pictures that Penna's talking about, or I'm concerned about tearing down some of these statues. It's all at the website, pointofview.net. And you'll have a chance next week to hear some of the interviews. I've got Frank Gaffney with me on Monday. I'll have N.T. Wright as well. I got all sorts of people. Wow. So it's going to be a great week. And, of course, looking forward to Penna's opportunity on Wednesday. And Chelsea will be heading up the Millennial Roundtable on Thursday. So it's going to be a great week. Have a great weekend. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.